That bottle of cooking oil sitting next to your stove right now? Yeah, the one you grabbed from Coles or Woolworths without giving it a second thought. We need to talk about that, because most Australians don't realize what actually happens to a lot of these oils once the pan gets properly hot. Not warm, hot. A big chunk of the cooking oils sold across Aussie supermarkets are made from seeds that were never meant to handle high heat in the first place. And when certain refined seed oils are pushed like that, food chemistry shows something uncomfortable happens. They break down, they oxidize, they form aldehydes, compounds linked to inflammation and metabolic stress when exposure is frequent. Not once a week, not every now and then, every day. Think about it. Breakfast eggs, a quick stir fry, dinner in the pan, same oil, over and over. Here's the part that catches people out. Australian food labeling laws don't require brands to tell you how heavily an oil has been processed. They just have to list the source. Sunflower, canola, soybean, whatever sounds familiar. That's it. So you can have two bottles sitting side by side on the shelf. Same price, same green packaging, same health-sounding claims. But the moment they hit a hot pan, they behave completely differently. One stays relatively stable. The other quietly breaks down. And nothing on the front label warns you. That's exactly why we're making this video. We're breaking down 7 cooking oils Australians use every single day. Which ones deserve a warning? Which ones are less of a problem? And how to read the label properly before heat turns healthy into something else. Before we start the list, one quick thing. If you care about what you're actually feeding your family, and you want straight label-based analysis instead of food fads or panic headlines, make sure you're subscribed. We don't tell you what to fear. We don't do hype. We show you what's really on the label, so you can make up your own mind. All right, let's start with number 7. Food labeling laws require companies to list the ingredient. They don't require them to explain the refining process. So 2 bottles can look clean, simple, and almost identical on the shelf, while being the result of very different levels of industrial processing. That's why canola oil lands at number 7. Not because it's toxic, not because it should never be used, but because daily, high-heat use, under the assumption that it's neutral or protective, is where the risk actually starts. And as we move to number 6, things get more uncomfortable. Because the next oil isn't just unstable under heat, it's aggressively marketed as heart-healthy, despite being even more heavily processed than canola. Let's move on to number 6. Number 6, sunflower oil. This one surprises a lot of people. Sunflower oil is seen as a safe, everyday option in a lot of Australian homes. It feels light, clean, almost harmless. You'll see it everywhere. Coles, Woolworths, home brands, bulk bottles, pan frying, shallow frying, baking. Anything that's meant to feel a bit lighter. And once again, the label doesn't raise any red flags. Flip the bottle over and you usually see one line: sunflower oil. That's it. No additives, no preservatives. Nothing that makes you stop and think. But just like canola, the problem isn't what's written there. It's what the oil is made of, and how it behaves once heat enters the picture. Sunflower oil is naturally very high in omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. That detail matters more than most people realize. Polyunsaturated fats have multiple double bonds in their structure, and those bonds make the oil highly reactive when it's exposed to heat, oxygen, or light. So when sunflower oil is heated, especially during frying or repeated cooking, it oxidizes easily, very easily. Food chemistry research has shown this again and again. Heating omega-6 rich oils can lead to the formation of lipid peroxides and aldehydes, reactive compounds that place oxidative stress on the body when exposure is frequent. Not dramatic exposure, routine exposure. And once again, this isn't about using sunflower oil occasionally. It's about how it's actually used. Because sunflower oil is marketed as light, natural, and heart-friendly, it often ends up in multiple meals across the day. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, same oil, same pattern. Over time, that creates consistent exposure to oxidized fats, not in extreme amounts, but steadily, quietly. There's another layer most people never hear about. Sunflower seeds don't contain large amounts of oil. To extract it efficiently at industrial scale, manufacturers rely on high heat, heavy mechanical pressure, chemical solvents, and multiple refining steps, bleaching and deodorizing included. By the time sunflower oil reaches the bottle, its original structure has already been heavily altered, and refined polyunsaturated oils don't cope well with heat. They break down faster than more stable fats. That's just chemistry. You'll often hear sunflower oil described as having a high smoke point. That sounds reassuring, but smoke point isn't the same thing as heat stability. An oil can sit in the pan looking perfectly fine, no smoke, no smell, while still degrading at the molecular level. This is where a lot of Australian consumers get misled. The oil looks clean, the label looks simple, the marketing sounds safe. But chemically, sunflower oil is one of the least stable choices for frequent heating. That doesn't mean sunflower oil is poison, and it doesn't mean it can never be used. But when an oil high in omega-6 polyunsaturated fats is used daily, under heat, across multiple meals, it becomes a very different kind of exposure than most people realize. That's why sunflower oil lands at number 6 on this list of cooking oils Australians use every day that deserve a warning. And as we move to number 5, things get harder to spot. Because the next oil isn't just unstable, it's often sold as a blend, which makes it much harder to know what you're actually cooking with. Let's move on to number 5. Vegetable oil. The blended stuff. This is one of the most misleading products sitting in Australian kitchens, and most people don't even realize it. Vegetable oil is everywhere. Woolworths, Coles, home brands, big bottles, cheap price. It's usually the go-to for frying, baking, everyday cooking. Neutral, all-purpose, nothing fancy. But here's the first thing to understand. Vegetable oil isn't actually a single oil. That name sounds simple, reassuring even, but it hides a lot. Flip the bottle over and the ingredient list usually says something like vegetable oil, soybean, sunflower, canola, or some variation of that blend. And that's where the problem starts. Unlike oils made from a single source, vegetable oil is typically a mix of multiple refined seed oils combined based on cost, supply, and shelf life, not on how they perform under heat. From a food chemistry perspective, that matters a lot. Each of those oils, soybean, sunflower, canola, is already high in polyunsaturated fats. On their own, they're unstable when heated. Blended together, their vulnerability goes up, not down, especially during frying, or repeated cooking, or reheating, which is how vegetable oil is actually used in real kitchens. When these blends are heated, they're more likely to form oxidized fats and aldehydes, the same reactive compounds we've already talked about. These aren't nutrients, they're breakdown products. And research links frequent exposure to things like inflammation, oxidative stress, and metabolic strain. Once again, this isn't about one meal. It's about patterns. Vegetable oil tends to get used for everything. Pan frying, deep frying, baking, reheating leftovers, which means it's often heated again, and again, and again. Exactly the conditions that accelerate fat breakdown. There's another issue most people never hear about. Because vegetable oil is a blend, manufacturers can change the ratio of oils over time without making it obvious. One bottle might be mostly soybean oil. The next one might lean heavily on sunflower or canola. From your point of view, nothing looks different. Same label, same price, same name. But chemically, you're cooking with a different product. That's what makes vegetable oil so hard to evaluate from the label alone. And once again, Australian food labeling laws don't help much here. Brands have to list the source oils. They don't have to explain how refined those oils are. And they don't have to tell you when the blend changes from batch to batch. So consumers end up trusting a generic name, while cooking daily with something that's highly processed, chemically unstable under heat, and inconsistent by design. That's why vegetable oil lands at number 5 on this list. Not because it's immediately dangerous, not because it should never be used, but because daily use of blended, refined seed oils, especially for frying, creates a level of exposure most Australians don't realize they're getting. Now, as we move to number 4, things get even trickier, because the next oil isn't sold as cheap or generic. It's sold as premium, as healthy, as a smarter choice, and that's exactly why people stop questioning it. Before we move on, one quick thing. This video isn't about taking everything away and leaving you with nothing to cook with. By the end of the list, I'll show you practical alternatives that are far more stable for everyday cooking, and explain why they behave so differently under heat. Once you see the pattern behind these oils, the replacement becomes obvious. All right, let's move on to number 4. Number 4, rice bran oil. This is where things start to feel a bit uncomfortable, because number 4 is an oil many Australians genuinely believe is a health upgrade. Rice bran oil. You'll see it positioned as premium, heart-friendly, ideal for high-heat cooking, Cobram Estate, Sunrice, supermarket better choice versions. For a lot of people, rice bran oil feels like the smarter step away from canola or sunflower. But when you look past the marketing and actually look at the chemistry, the story changes. Flip the bottle over and the label usually looks clean. Rice bran oil. You might also see claims like high smoke point, contains antioxidants, heart healthy, all reassuring on the surface. But once again, the ingredient name doesn't tell you what really matters. Rice bran oil is extracted from the outer layer of rice grains, a layer that contains very little oil naturally. To make rice bran oil viable at industrial scale, manufacturers rely on high heat, mechanical pressure, solvent extraction, and then extensive refining, bleaching, and deodorizing. That level of processing isn't incidental. It fundamentally changes how the oil behaves. Here's a detail that almost never gets discussed. Rice bran oil contains a mix of monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, which is often presented as a positive. But from a heat stability perspective, it puts the oil in a chemically awkward middle ground. The polyunsaturated fraction is still high enough to make the oil prone to oxidation under frequent heat. And this isn't theoretical. Studies in lipid chemistry have shown that rice bran oil begins forming oxidation products, including aldehydes, at temperatures below its advertised smoke point, especially during prolonged or repeated heating. That's the key part people miss. Smoke point tells you when oil smokes. It does not tell you when oil degrades. Chemical breakdown can start well before you see anything in the pan. Now, you'll often hear about compounds like georesinol being used to market rice bran oil as protective or antioxidant rich. Here's what's rarely mentioned. Those compounds are heat sensitive. They're also affected by refining and deodorization. Measured concentrations of georesinol can drop significantly during processing, and drop further when the oil is exposed to cooking temperatures. So the theoretical benefit exists, but the real-world benefit is far smaller than the label implies. What you're left with is still a refined oil containing reactive fatty acids. And because rice bran oil is marketed as premium and better for you, people tend to use it confidently, daily, often exclusively, often at high heat. That frequency is where the concern lies, not in one meal, not in occasional use, but in repeated exposure to an oil that looks stable, sounds healthy, and feels like an upgrade, while still sharing many of the same chemical weaknesses as other refined seed oils. That's why rice bran oil earns the number 4 spot on this list. Not because it's poison, not because it should never be used, but because it's sold as a solution, while quietly behaving like what it replaced. And as we move to number 3, the issue becomes even more subtle, because the next oil doesn't look refined at all. In fact, it's often described as natural. Let's move on to number 3. Number 3, extra light olive oil. This one trips a lot of Australians up. Because number 3 sounds like a smart choice. Extra light olive oil. You'll see it from big trusted names, Bertolli, Cobra Estate, supermarket versions. And it's usually picked by people who are genuinely trying to do the right thing, especially when cooking at higher heat. The word olive builds trust. The word light feels reassuring. And that's exactly where the confusion starts. Flip the bottle over and the ingredient list usually just says olive oil. Sometimes in smaller print, you'll see something like refined olive oil or olive oil blend. Most people miss that part. Here's the key thing almost no one explains properly. Extra light does not mean fewer calories, and it does not mean gentler processing. It means the oil has been heavily refined to remove flavor, aroma, and color. From a food science point of view, that changes everything. Extra light olive oil has gone through refining and deodorizing processes that strip away most of the natural antioxidants, things like polyphenols, that make extra virgin olive oil protective in the first place. Those compounds aren't decoration. They're what help olive oil resist oxidation under heat. Once they're gone, the oil behaves very differently. Visually, extra light olive oil can tolerate higher temperatures. It won't smoke as quickly. It won't smell strong. But chemically, it's far more exposed. Without those protective antioxidants, the oil becomes more vulnerable to oxidation, much closer to refined oils than people realize. This is why researchers make a very clear distinction between extra virgin olive oil and refined or light olive oils. They're not interchangeable. They're not even close. Extra light olive oil often gets used daily for frying, roasting, and pan cooking under the assumption that it's a healthier high heat option. In reality, it sits in an uncomfortable middle space, not as unstable as some seed oils, but nowhere near as protective as people assume when they hear the word olive. That's why extra light olive oil lands at number 3. Not because olive oil is bad, and not because it should be avoided altogether, but because refining changes how it behaves, and daily high heat use quietly removes the benefits people think they're getting. Now, as we move to number 2, things get even more deceptive, because the next oil is often marketed as natural, pure, and cold-pressed, yet behaves very differently once heat enters the picture. Let's move on to number 2. Number 2, grapeseed oil. This one catches a lot of Australians out, because grapeseed oil is usually chosen for one simple reason: it feels clean, neutral taste, light color, no smell, no drama. You'll see it everywhere: Moro, Coles, Woolworths. And it's often used exactly where people think they're being careful: high heat cooking, sautéing, frying. The logic sounds reasonable. If it doesn't smoke and doesn't taste strong, it must be stable. That assumption is where things go wrong. Flip the bottle over and the ingredient list usually says one thing: grapeseed oil. No additives, no preservatives. Looks harmless. But once again, the label skips the part that actually matters. Grapeseed oil comes from grape seeds. And grape seeds contain almost no oil naturally, which means extracting it at scale isn't simple. To do it, manufacturers rely on chemical solvent extraction, followed by refining, bleaching, and deodorizing. By the time grapeseed oil reaches the bottle, it's been pushed hard. From a nutrition science point of view, there's another issue that rarely gets explained properly. Grapeseed oil is extremely high in omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. Not moderately high, extremely high. And omega-6 polyunsaturated fats are chemically fragile under heat. Food chemistry research has shown this consistently. When oils rich in omega-6 fats are heated, they oxidize rapidly and form oxidized lipids and aldehydes, reactive compounds linked to inflammation and cellular stress when exposure is frequent. This isn't controversial. It's basic lipid chemistry. And grapeseed oil is often used in the exact conditions that make this worse: high heat, repeated cooking, daily use. There's another layer that confuses people. Because grapeseed oil tastes neutral and doesn't smoke easily, it looks stable in the pan. But smoke is a late signal. Chemical degradation can start well before anything smells burnt or looks wrong. so the oil can appear calm on the surface, while breaking down underneath. This is why in research circles, grapeseed oil is often ranked among the least suitable oils for regular high-heat cooking, despite how popular it's become in home kitchens. That contrast is important, because no one is choosing grapeseed oil to be reckless. They're choosing it to be careful. That's exactly why it lands at number 2, not because it's immediately harmful, and not because a single meal will cause problems, but because daily use of a highly refined omega-6 rich oil under heat creates a level of oxidative exposure most people never intend and are never warned about. And now we reach number 1, the oil most Australians trust the most, use the most confidently, and question the least. Let's move on to number 1. Number 1, generic vegetable oil used for frying. This isn't a single brand, and that's exactly why it sits at number 1. It's generic vegetable oil used for frying. The oil sitting in fry pans, deep fryers, and benchtop cookers across Australia. Often reused, often reheated, and almost never questioned. Coles vegetable oil, Woolworths vegetable oil, whatever blend happens to be cheapest that week. It's popular because it's neutral, affordable, and sold as all-purpose. But from a food chemistry perspective, this is where everything we've talked about so far comes together. Flip the bottle over and the label usually lists something like vegetable oil, canola, soybean, sunflower. What it doesn't tell you is how refined those oils are, how unstable they become under high heat, or what happens when they're heated, cooled, and reheated again. And frying is the worst possible environment for these oils. Most vegetable oils are high in polyunsaturated fats, and polyunsaturated fats are extremely vulnerable to heat-induced oxidation. When these oils are pushed to frying temperatures, especially when they're reused, they rapidly form oxidized fats, aldehydes, and other lipid breakdown products. Here's the part people don't realize. Cooling doesn't reset the oil. Those compounds don't disappear. They accumulate. Food toxicology research has shown that repeated heating of polyunsaturated seed oils dramatically increases the concentration of these reactive byproducts. That's why frying oil is such a concern. Not one meal, not one takeaway night. It's repeated exposure. Home frying, oil-coated air fryers, pan reuse, oil heated, cooled, and reheated again. From a physiological point of view, frequent intake of these oxidized compounds is linked in research to systemic inflammation, oxidative stress, and metabolic strain. This doesn't show up as an immediate reaction. There's no alarm bell. It shows up quietly, over time. And because vegetable oil is cheap and familiar, it's often used without much restraint. That's why generic vegetable oil used for frying earns the number 1 spot on this list. Not because people are careless, and not because frying once is dangerous, but because the combination of refined seed oils, high heat, and repeated use creates the highest risk scenario in everyday cooking. And this is usually the moment people realize something important. The issue isn't cooking, it's what you're cooking with. Once you've seen the pattern, the alternatives stop being confusing. More stable cooking fats tend to share a few key traits: simpler processing, fewer polyunsaturated fats, better resistance to heat and oxidation. That's why traditionally used fats behave differently. Things like extra virgin olive oil for low to medium heat true, minimally refined avocado oil for higher heat butter, or ghee for certain cooking methods. None of these are perfect. No food is. But structurally, they're more stable, which means they're less likely to break down into reactive compounds when heated. The goal isn't to replace everything overnight. It's to reduce daily exposure to oils that were never designed for constant high-heat cooking. Even small changes matter. Rotating oils instead of using one for everything, avoiding repeated reheating, choosing stability over marketing language. Once you start thinking this way, labels make more sense. And cooking becomes a lot less confusing. Because real health isn't about fear. It's about understanding how food actually behaves. If this video made you look differently at the oil in your kitchen, let us know in the comments. Which one surprised you the most? And if you want more clear, label-based investigations into everyday foods Australians use without questioning, make sure you're subscribed to Aussie Food Insider. We don't follow trends. We read labels, study the science, and break it down, so you can decide what's right for your home. Because staying informed starts in your own kitchen.